Sometimes the wild doesn't roar. It waits, watches, and remembers. This is the story of a battered German shepherd who emerged from the shadows of a canyon, not as a stray, but as a guardian. What he did next would change everything for a ranger, for lost children, and for anyone who's ever believed in second chances. If stories of courage and quiet miracles move you, gently tap, like, subscribe, and stay with us to witness a journey you won't forget. The morning air over the Kaibab Plateau still carried the bite of winter. Though spring had technically arrived, the early light over northern Arizona painted the Grand Canyon in shades of icy lavender and rust. Winds brushed across the red cliffs and moaned through the ravines, stirring the brittle sagebrush like hands sifting through memory. In the distance, the Colorado River whispered unseen, hidden deep beneath the ancient layers of earth. This was no place for the unprepared. It was wild in a way that remembered everything. Emily Brooks tightened the straps of her olive ranger vest and adjusted the brim of her cap. At 32, she had long abandoned the illusion of comfort in this line of work. Her face bore freckles across high cheekbones and a pale scar along her jaw, faint but visible. She was of medium build, but wiry with strength born of years spent under desert suns and canyon shadows. There was a steadiness to her that came not from arrogance, but from survival. Before the wilderness, there had been hospitals, fluorescent lights, and sterile gloves, her former life as a veterinary trauma specialist in Tucson. That life ended 3 years ago with a head-on collision on Route 86 and a slow, agonizing recovery. When her hands stopped shaking, she chose the woods over the operating table. Here, she didn't fix pain, she listened to it. This morning's patrol began like any other. A routine sweep through Sector C of the Grand Canyon Preservation Zone. But within 30 minutes, the canyon had fallen unnervingly silent. The usual morning chorus wrens, scrub jays, even the distant calls of bighorn sheep had been replaced by something else, a palpable absence. She stopped near a ridge blanketed with crumbling sandstone and dried juniper. Something was wrong. She didn't hear danger, she felt it. Then it came, a sound not native to this land. A heavy, dragging thud, followed by something slow and wet slithering across gravel. The hairs on the back of her neck stood. She moved cautiously down a shallow gulch, her boots crunching softly over dry soil. The wind shifted and carried with it a strange scent, earthy, pungent, not quite right. Her right hand instinctively went to the stun baton secured at her belt, a non-lethal deterrent meant for aggressive wildlife encounters. But she had the feeling this wouldn't be enough. As she neared a dried creek bed, a dark shape came into view beneath a cluster of overhanging rocks. At first, it seemed like two animals fighting. Then, as her eyes adjusted, the horror clarified. A massive wild dog, no, not just any dog. A German shepherd, easily over 120 pounds, lay in the dirt, his massive chest rising and falling in tight, shallow heaves. Wrapped around him like a grotesque rope of muscle and scale was a monstrous snake, greenish-black, its body pulsing with terrible force. Its head, flat and wide, rested on the dog's shoulder, and every few seconds it squeezed tighter. An anaconda in Arizona. Emily blinked in disbelief. Anacondas weren't native. This had to be an illegal release. Someone had brought this apex predator here, likely for exotic hunting. Her gut clenched. This wasn't just about one animal. This was about a deeper human cruelty woven into the wild. But now wasn't the time for outrage. The shepherd was enormous, his sable and black coat matted with dried mud and speckled with old scars. He had clearly been living wild for years. His ears were uneven, one torn, one perked weakly. Despite the pain, his amber eyes were open-clouded but sharp and locked on Emily the moment she stepped closer. She froze. He didn't snarl. He didn't whimper. He simply watched. Emily lowered herself behind a boulder, scanning for options. The stun baton could buy her seconds, if she could get close enough. But even that felt like gambling with 2 lives. She needed to think, to plan. A rustle behind her broke the moment. She turned slowly, expecting perhaps a coyote or a deer. What she saw instead froze her breath. 3 mountain lions, each lean and sleek, with golden eyes and twitching tails, stood just beyond the gulch in tall prairie grass. Juveniles, not fully grown, likely siblings. They watched the scene silently. Their muscles were tense, but they made no move. They weren't hunting. Not yet. Emily's heart pounded. The moment teetered on a knife's edge. Predators surrounded her, one striking, others lurking. And yet, no one moved. The lions didn't see prey. They saw something else. Perhaps they too recognized desperation. Or perhaps they were waiting to scavenge the aftermath. Regardless, they had not pounced. Emily slowly stepped back behind the rock. The German shepherd was weakening. She could see his ribs under the pressure. His back legs had stopped kicking. One paw twitched. The wind shifted again, blowing cold air up from the canyon floor. Time was running out. She touched the stun baton gently, but didn't draw it. Not yet. Instead, she locked eyes once more with the great dog. Something passed between them. Not a plea, but something more ancient, an understanding. She whispered under her breath, "Hold on." And then she crouched, eyes scanning for an opening, her mind racing. The attack would come soon. The risk would be everything. But not now. Not yet. The mountains watched. The snake squeezed. The dog barely breathed. And Emily waited, the canyon holding its breath alongside her. The canyon wind had picked up, tugging at Emily Brooks's jacket as she crouched behind the boulder, eyes fixed on the silent standoff in the dried creek bed. The dog no, the beast was losing the fight. The snake's body pulsed in rhythmic constriction, and the shepherd's limbs no longer twitched. His breath came in shallow, trembling bursts. The mountain lions remained statues in the tall grass, unmoved. Emily knew the moment to act was slipping away. But even if she wanted to charge in now, she didn't have the tools. The stun baton was only enough for a quick jolt, but she needed something more: meds, distraction gear, even a tranquilizer. She muttered under her breath, "I'll come back for you." Then she backed away, slow and low, avoiding the lion's line of sight, her boots crunching softly against the gravel. Once behind the ridge, she rose and took off at a half-run through the switchback trails, lungs burning from the altitude. The ranger outpost, a narrow wooden cabin built into a red rock alcove near Cedar Creek, was still a 45-minute hike at best. She moved swiftly, mentally checking her emergency inventory. The tranquilizer kit was in the cooler chest, and she had a stronger electric shock baton in storage. There were also a few doses of dexamethasone, a steroid used to prevent shock in injured animals. Bear, if he survived the next hour, would need it. By the time she reached the outpost, the sun had risen high enough to cast golden light through the canyon's ragged teeth. Inside, the air was cool, musty with the scent of stored packs, maps, and leather. She threw open the metal storage cabinet and pulled out the stun rifle, a bulkier, high-frequency tool meant for subduing wildcats. She slung it over her shoulder, grabbed a dose of injectable Dex, a syringe, a thermal blanket, and a collapsible muzzle. She didn't know what state the dog would be in, but she'd rather come over prepared. As she was loading the items into her gear bag, she noticed something odd on the station's radio log sheet. A transmission had been received the previous afternoon, an alert from an independent hunting lodge situated off the grid about 12 miles north, beyond the permitted boundary. The call had been logged but ignored. Emily frowned. The lodge, run by a man named Dalton Rusk, had a reputation. While officially registered as a wilderness photography and survival tourism operation, rumors often tied it to illegal trophy activities. But there'd never been solid proof. Emily walked to the bulletin board where maps and trail alerts were pinned. She traced a finger along the border zones and found it. Rusk's property, just outside regulated space, backing against the same valley where she'd encountered the anaconda. The realization struck her like a slap. That snake didn't belong in Arizona. Someone had brought it here, and Rusk had motive. She stepped outside, letting the canyon wind fill her lungs again. Her mission was simple: get back to the dog. But something deeper had shifted inside her. This wasn't just about a rescue anymore. Something was happening in these canyons that had no place in a protected preserve. She secured her bag and began the return trip, her mind split between two urgencies. With every step closer to the gulch, the image of that dying shepherd pressed harder against her chest. About halfway down, near a bend in the trail, she spotted movement ahead. A man. Average height, broad-shouldered, wearing a camo vest and heavy boots. He was dragging something behind him, a metal crate on wheels, the kind used for transporting medium-sized predators. Emily's hand dropped instinctively to her belt, though her badge was buried under her jacket. "Morning," she called out evenly. The man turned. He was in his late 40s, weathered by sun, with a tobacco stain on his lip and a sharp, distrustful squint. His hair was sun-bleached blonde, the texture of dry straw. His name came to her a second later. Tyler Lance, a known associate of Dalton Rusk, a former hunting guide who'd lost his license after a baiting scandal in Utah, a man who made his living skirting legality by inches. "Ranger Brooks," he said with a slow nod. "Didn't expect company this far out." Emily kept her voice neutral. "We had a strange wildlife event reported near the basin, big animal activity." "You transporting something?" "Just moving a piece of equipment back to the lodge. Camera trap." His voice was slick, but his eyes flicked once, nervously, toward the crate. Emily took a step closer. Through the mesh grating, she spotted faint stains, red-brown smears too thick to be dirt. There were also several deep scratches on the inside of the cage. "Looks like it's been used recently." Tyler shrugged. "Had a bobcat in it. Bit of a scare, that's all." Emily stared at him for another breath. "Well, you know the rules. Exotic species are illegal on protected land, especially if they're being used for bait." Tyler smirked, but it didn't reach his eyes. "You're always looking for trouble that doesn't exist, Ranger." "Sometimes it finds me," she said, stepping aside. "Be careful on the trail." He pushed the crate along, wheels squealing faintly against the dust. Emily waited until he disappeared into the bend, then tapped her radio. "This is Ranger Brooks to Central Dispatch. Log a note. Possible illegal animal transport observed on Trail 42. Suspect, Tyler Lance, linked to Rusk Lodge." The reply crackled through. "Noted. Confirm status." She hesitated. "Still pursuing a medical emergency. Will report outcome in 1 hour." With that, she began running. By the time she reached the gulch again, sweat had soaked the collar of her shirt. The clearing was silent. The mountain lions were gone. The trampled grass where the snake had coiled lay disturbed but empty. Then she saw the shepherd. He hadn't moved far, maybe only a few feet, but he was still breathing. Barely. His flanks shuddered with each breath, his tongue lolling slightly to the side. Dried blood crusted along his ribcage. Emily knelt beside him, gently brushing back fur to locate a vein. "Hey, big guy," she murmured. "I'm back." She injected the Dex and then laid the thermal blanket over his body. His eyes flickered. For a split second, they met hers. Not fear, just weariness. She stayed beside him, listening to his shallow breathing, her hand resting lightly on his shoulder. The wind moved again, bringing with it the scent of earth and something else. Unspoken tension, like a storm not yet broken. Something was wrong in these canyons, and Bear might be the key to unraveling it all. The canyon had quieted again, but not in the way it had earlier that morning. The silence now was dense, watchful-like, a breath held in the chest of the earth. Emily Brooks crouched low beside the massive German shepherd, her fingers resting lightly on his side, feeling the slow, labored rise and fall of his chest beneath the thermal blanket. His breath came in thin, uneven bursts. He was still alive, but just barely. The dexamethasone injection would buy him time, but not much more. She checked the pulse again and spoke softly, almost to herself. "You're tougher than you look, big guy." In truth, Bear, as she had silently named him, was the toughest thing she'd ever seen. Covered in battle scars and lean from survival, his thick double coat was caked with dust and dried blood. But his body was built for strength and endurance. Up close, she saw the faint tattoo on the inside of his ear military issue. He had once belonged to someone, a handler, a mission. And yet, here he was, abandoned or lost, left to fend for himself in the unforgiving vastness of the Arizona Canyonlands. She reached for her canteen, uncapped it, and poured a small trickle of water into her palm. With effort, Bear lifted his head a few inches and lapped weakly at the liquid. The moment was fragile, quiet, and full of something unnamed. Gratitude, perhaps. Or resignation. Then, a soft sound, barely more than a whisper, drifted through the still air. Not wind, not water. A low, rustling hush, as if grass itself were drawing a breath. Emily turned her head slowly. In the underbrush, half shrouded by shadow and rock, yellow eyes stared back. 1, then 2, then 3, 4. She counted 6 in total. A group of North American bobcats, Lynx rufus, had gathered around the perimeter of the dry creek bed. Their coats were tawny gray, mottled with dark spots and stripes that allowed them to melt into the canyon's dusty palette. They were lean, muscular, with sharp ears tipped in black and shoulders that rolled low to the ground as they moved. Normally solitary, seeing this many in one place was highly unusual. They didn't approach. They didn't growl or hiss. They simply watched. Emily's fingers tightened on the stun rifle slung across her back. Bobcats weren't generally a threat to humans, but this wasn't a normal circumstance. These were wild predators, cunning, patient, and opportunistic. What held them at bay now was unclear. Perhaps it was the scent of the anaconda still lingering in the dust. Or perhaps it was something stranger, a pause in the order of things, as though nature itself were holding its decision. The largest of the bobcats stood apart from the others. It had a split ear and a long scar running diagonally across its snout. Its eyes, cold and alert, were locked directly on Bear. Emily slowly stood to her feet, shifting to place herself between the shepherd and the predators. Her stance was defensive, but not aggressive. She didn't want to provoke. "I don't know what your rules are," she whispered, "but this one's with me." She didn't expect the cats to understand, but there was something primal in her words, something that belonged to the dirt and the wind and the blood-stained sun. None of the bobcats moved. In the distance, a hawk cried once sharp, high-pitched and brief. The moment held. Then, almost as if responding to some invisible signal, the largest bobcat blinked once, turned, and padded away into the brush. One by one, the others followed, soundless as ghosts. Within seconds, the clearing was empty once more, leaving only the weak scent of fur and stone. Emily exhaled, a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. The desert, once again, was hers. She turned her attention back to Bear. He had lifted his head slightly, following the retreating shapes with his eyes. There was no panic in his gaze-only awareness. She had the strangest sense that he understood what had just happened, that he had been watched, judged, and for reasons she would never fully grasp, he had been spared. "You've got allies in strange places," she muttered. Then she reached for her sat phone, grateful to find a single bar of signal. She called in a Medivac request to the closest veterinary field unit, an emergency extraction team from Flagstaff that serviced the wildlife reserve. The voice on the other end belonged to Dr. Leslie Rayner, a mobile field vet in her late 40s. Leslie was tall, with silver hair always tied in a French braid, and had a reputation for doing the impossible with almost no gear. "I can be there in 2 hours," Leslie said, "but I need coordinates and a heads up. What am I walking into?" "Large German shepherd, military tattooed, recently attacked by a constrictor," Emily replied. "Severe muscular trauma, shock likely, minor external bleeding. And there were bobcats." "Define were." "They're gone, for now, but something's off. It's like all the animals are holding their breath." There was a pause on the line. "Send location. I'll bring the kit." Emily gave the coordinates and hung up. While she waited, she focused on stabilizing Bear. She wrapped a compression bandage around his midsection, cleaned the worst of the wounds, and offered him more water. He didn't resist, but neither did he lean into her hand. He was still half in another world, a place where pain was constant and safety was abstract. The sun crept higher, shadows shortened. Somewhere in the distance, an ATV engine roared. Leslie arrived just past noon, driving an off-road rescue rig built like a tank. She climbed out, her long legs covered in trail dust, dark circles under her eyes. "Damn," she said, crouching beside Bear. "This one's been through hell." Emily nodded and walked out of it on his own. They worked quickly, fluids, pain management, partial sedation. Leslie examined the military tattoo more closely. "This number's familiar. I think he might have been part of the K-9 rescue unit at Fort Drum. They had a few dogs go missing after that transport accident 3 years ago." Emily blinked. "He's been out here that long?" "Would explain the condition. This one's a survivor." Bear was loaded carefully onto the transport sled. Before the rig pulled away, Emily bent down and touched the thick fur near his neck. "You've got a name now," she said. "Bear, the canyon's own." His eyes fluttered half open. For a flicker of a moment, the golden gaze met hers. It wasn't recognition. It was something quieter. Trust. And then he slept. Finally safe. Night was falling fast over the canyon, and the sky bled into bruised hues of indigo and burnt orange. The wind had stilled, but the silence wasn't peaceful. It was heavy, like the land itself was waiting. Emily Brooks crouched beside the campfire she'd carefully built in a small stone hollow near the creek. Beside her, wrapped in a wool thermal blanket, lay Bear, his breathing slow but consistent. The sedation was still holding, thanks to Leslie's earlier intervention, but his pulse had thinned. Emily had administered antibiotics and fluids, cleaned what wounds she could, and used gauze to pad the worst bruising along his ribs and neck. The scarred shepherd hadn't made a sound. Emily, now in her second set of clothes, her sleeves rolled up, hair matted with sweat and smoke, watched the last embers dance. Her face was tired, but her eyes still burned with the kind of awareness forged only by sleepless nights and moral weight. She hadn't left Bear's side in hours, but she also hadn't slept. The rig Leslie had arrived in had broken down not long after transport began. A busted radiator hose, probably. The vet had left in the direction of the station to call for further extraction support, promising to return with backup by morning. That left Emily alone with Bear in the wilderness. She was halfway through jotting field notes in her weatherproof logbook when her radio crackled to life. "Ranger Brooks, do you copy? This is dispatch. Repeat. This is dispatch Flagstaff. Come in." Emily grabbed the unit. "Brooks here. Go ahead." The voice on the other end belonged to Alan, a younger operator, fresh out of training, with a nervous habit of over-articulating. "We've received an emergency ping from a school hiking group, 3 juveniles and 1 adult chaperone. Lost somewhere north of Trail 6. Last contact approximately 90 minutes ago. GPS suggests they're disoriented and heading into restricted high terrain." Emily's stomach tightened. Trail 6 ran close to the eastern ravine, an area known for unstable rock and sudden drop-offs. "Have they tried ascending?" "Unclear. Last ping puts them in the tree line below Flat Mesa Bluff. It's going to be pitch black in 20. Emily looked at Bear, then up at the path disappearing into shadows. She had no doubt that if those kids weren't found by sunrise, they'd be statistics. Another set of silhouettes carved into the canyon's cruel history. "Any other rangers closer?" "Negative. Closest unit is you." Of course it was. Emily stared at Bear, torn. He needed monitoring. But the kids, those weren't hypothetical lives. They were real, scared, and probably cold. She radioed back. "Send coordinates. I'm on it." As the digital map updated on her tracker, she rose and opened her survival kit. She tucked in flares, extra water, a roll of gauze, and a secondary beacon. Then she turned back to Bear and gently placed her hand on his neck. "I need you to hold the line a little longer, soldier." He stirred faintly, his head shifting, his golden eyes flickering open just enough to meet hers. "I'll come back," she whispered. To reduce heat loss, she reinforced the blanket over him, tucked in rocks still warm from the fire to create a makeshift heat sink, and left one of her wool socks by his chest. It carried her scent, a signal of intent. Emily moved fast through the thinning woods, flashlight low to avoid startling wildlife. As she climbed a narrow ridge leading up to Flat Mesa Bluff, she encountered no signs of the usual canyon life. No rustle of jackrabbits, no calls of night birds, just stillness and cold. An hour in, her radio crackled again, barely audible. "Dispatch 2 kids found a high ledge, winds increasing, visibility low." "Copy," Emily breathed, scanning upward. The bluff loomed just ahead. She began the last climb, a steep ascent of jagged rocks and sliding gravel. Her boots skidded more than once. Her calves screamed. And then she heard it, crying. A child's sob, close but thin with exhaustion. She scrambled over the last rise and found them. 3 children, 2 boys, maybe 8 and 10, and a girl with red braids and a bloodied knee were huddled against a sheer rock wall. Their teacher, a man in his 40s, was slumped nearby, his leg twisted at an unnatural angle. His face was pale, sweat-drenched, and his glasses were cracked. His name, as it turned out, was Mr. Glenn. Tall, thin, with thinning hair and an apologetic tone even in pain. Emily immediately activated her emergency beacon and moved toward them. "I'm Ranger Brooks. You're safe now." She triaged Glenn's leg with splints from her pack and gave the kids protein bars and water. The youngest boy, Lucas, clung to her sleeve. "Are we gonna die?" he asked. "Not a chance. Emily said, her voice firm but gentle. She led them carefully down the trail, radioing updates as they moved. The descent took over 2 hours. By the time they reached the lower trailhead, an ATV from a nearby ranger substation had arrived with paramedics. The children were wrapped in blankets and whisked away. Glenn was stretchered in with a thank you that trembled with guilt. Emily declined the ride back. She had a dog waiting. The hike back to Bear's resting place was slow. Her body ached, her feet throbbed, but her mind was clear. When she returned, Dawn was just cresting over the ridge. Bear was gone. Her heart dropped, but then she saw him. He wasn't far, just 20 feet up the slope, standing shakily on all fours. He turned to her with ears slightly raised and eyes that said one thing. He'd waited. Emily dropped to her knees and let out a breathless laugh. "You stubborn old thing!" He didn't bark, he didn't growl, but he took 2 slow steps toward her and sat, exhausted, battered, but alive. Together, they watched the sun rise. The canyon was still half asleep under the faint bruising of dawn, and yet the chill in the air bit sharper than it had all night. Emily Brooks stood facing the red-streaked sky, her boots scuffed, her hair damp with sweat and wind. Behind her, Bear sat quietly, head lifted, golden eyes locked on her with unblinking focus. They had not spoken, of course, but after what they'd been through, words seemed almost unnecessary. The night had changed both of them. Emily, who had come into the field expecting a standard patrol, had ended up saving children and nearly losing a dog that now felt like a silent guardian watching over her every move. And Bear, who had come close to dying, alone, had, against all odds, chosen not to disappear into the woods, but to wait. And now, it seemed, to follow. The night before, Emily had attempted to call for further assistance via radio. The response had been nothing but static, cut by occasional blips of distortion. They were too far from the closest tower, the canyon walls too thick, swallowing signal like the sky swallowed sound. The emergency extraction team for Bear still hadn't arrived, and Emily had no clue how long she'd be on her own. She ran her hand down Bear's flank. His fur was still damp where she had cleaned the wounds. Though stitched and wrapped, he bore the bruises of survival like old medals. He didn't whine or show signs of weakness. In fact, he hadn't made a sound since she'd found him. That silence said more than barks ever could. Emily glanced at the trail map on her GPS and frowned. The last known position of the school group had come from further east than she remembered, a cliffside fork between Trail 6 and the Mesa Crest Loop, somewhere she hadn't hiked in months. If anyone strayed off the path in that area, they'd be met with switchbacks, unstable shale, and long drops with no fencing. And the sun was rising fast, which meant the canyon would soon heat up and erase signs' footprints, bent grass, disturbed soil. Time was shrinking. She checked Bear once more. "You should stay here," she said softly, pointing to the shaded slope where she had left a second water bottle and her fleece jacket. "You're not ready." Bear stood. It was slow, with effort, but unmistakable. He rose onto all fours, gave a slight shake of his shoulders, and looked in the same direction she had. Then he took one step, then another. "Really?" she asked, eyebrows raised. "You sure?" Bear kept moving forward, stiff but determined, his tail low but not tucked. Every movement said he was hurting, but none said he would stop. Emily stared at him for a moment longer, then slung her pack over her shoulder. "All right then," she murmured. "Let's go." They began the hike in silence, moving through the thinning trees and the switchbacks beyond. Emily kept a steady pace, watching Bear out of the corner of her eye. His gait was uneven, favoring his right side, but he kept up. About a half-mile in, they encountered a narrow stream that cut across the path. On the far bank, Emily spotted something small and bright. A blue child's mitten. She picked it up and turned it over damp, stained with mud, but intact. Her breath caught. Someone had come this way. Bear sniffed the air, then began moving again, faster now. Emily followed, picking up speed. The terrain grew steeper, thorny brush catching their legs as they pressed forward. She caught sight of new signs. A broken water bottle cap, a piece of granola bar wrapper, and finally a shoe print, small and shallow in the dirt. They were close. Bear paused near a bend in the trail and growled softly. Not aggressive, but alert. Emily tensed. Just ahead, near a cluster of boulders, she spotted movement. A boy no, older than 10, wearing a gray hoodie and khaki shorts, stumbled out from the brush, eyes wide, face streaked with tears and grime. He froze when he saw her. "It's okay," Emily said, kneeling. "I'm a ranger. You're safe." The boy, whose name was Eli, nodded and wiped his nose. "I lost them," he whispered. "I heard something. I thought it was a bear." Emily looked down at Bear and almost laughed. "Close." Eli flinched as Bear approached, but the dog merely sniffed him once and sat down, tail thudding gently against the dirt. "He's with me," Emily assured. "He's special." Bear tilted his head slightly, watching the boy as if assessing him. Eli, in turn, reached out slowly and touched the dog's shoulder. "He looks like he's been through a war." Emily nodded. "He has." They moved quickly then. Eli directed her toward a split path where the rest of the group had gone left. Bear, as if sensing urgency, took the lead. They found the others two, more kids, huddled beneath a rocky overhang, and a second adult, a younger woman in her 20s with wide glasses and a puffy yellow parka. Her name was Lonnie, a volunteer chaperone with a warm, nervous smile and a sprained ankle from a fall the night before. She'd kept the kids awake by singing old folk songs under her breath and wrapping them in the lining of her coat. "You must be Ranger Brooks," she said when Emily arrived. "You look exactly how I hoped someone would look right now." Emily offered a tired grin. "And you're lucky I brought backup." She gestured to Bear, who stood just behind her, head tilted, eyes scanning the canyon. Lonnie's eyebrows lifted. "That is one very serious dog." "You don't know the half of it." Emily set up a temporary signal beacon and radioed coordinates again, hoping the signal would finally push through. As the sun reached its apex, she helped splint Lonnie's ankle and distributed the last of her rations among the group. Bear never left her side. Later, as they began the careful descent together, Lonnie limped beside Emily and looked back at the dog. "He followed you up here?" "Yeah. Why?" Emily glanced down at Bear, who was now walking beside one of the kids, letting the smallest girl rest her hand on his back for balance. "Because he knew someone needed help," she said. "And because he's a guardian, even when no one asks him to be." The canyon was awakening with golden light when Emily and the group reached the lower trailhead, its red walls glowing like embers beneath the sun. Dust clung to their boots and to the bruises on their faces, but the worst had passed. The children were safe. Lainey had found her balance with makeshift crutches, and Bear, despite every reason not to, was still moving. Emily looked down at the shepherd, his steps slow but precise. His wounds were healing, though his side still bore dark bruises under the patched bandages. There was strength in his silence, each step calculated, his eyes sweeping the tree line, ears twitching at the sound of distant movement. They'd barely caught their breath when Emily's radio crackled to life. "Brooks Dispatch here. We've got a possible secondary group unaccounted for. Flagged as part of the original school permit 2, students listed as Micah Yazzie and Nolan Kent. Last reported at Split Rock Basin. Possible off-route excursion. No radio from their party since yesterday." Emily's jaw tightened. Two more, still out there. She glanced at Bear. He had already stopped, head raised toward the wind as if listening. The trail from the ridgehead forked east and west. Emily knew the west led to Split Rock. The eastern path, recently cleared of brush, wound toward the ranger station and the others' safety. She turned to Lonnie, who was resting with her back against a large pine, her cheeks flushed but her gaze steady behind thick glasses. "I need you to lead the rest to the station. Follow the main trail. I've marked it." Lonnie nodded, adjusting the scarf around her neck. "We'll make it. You'll find them?" "I'll find them," Emily said. Bear stood beside her now, alert, waiting. Together, they turned toward the lesser-known fork that curved around the ridge into unfamiliar woods. The sun was higher now, but the path grew darker. Overhead, the trees thickened into a canopy of ponderosa pine and pinyon, their trunks leaning at uneasy angles from the windstorms of past years. This wasn't a trail she knew. It was barely a path more memory than map, and yet Bear seemed to know it. The shepherd moved ahead of her, weaving between stones and tree roots, every few steps glancing back to ensure she followed. Twice, he halted once to sniff a seemingly random patch of earth, where a thin rusted wire was half buried in the dirt. A poacher's snare. Emily carefully disabled it with a small pair of pliers she kept in her vest. The second time, he stopped before a slick patch of shale just before a steep slope. She nearly stepped forward blindly, but he barked once, short and sharp. She froze and looked down beneath the layer of shale. The rock had fractured, forming a natural slide that dropped 20 feet into thick underbrush. "You've done this before," she whispered. Bear turned and led her around the safer edge. They moved for nearly an hour before the canyon opened up again, revealing a wide expanse of sandstone flats leading to the edge of a cliff. Below, a river carved a jagged scar through the stone, and on the far side of the cliff, backed up against a half-collapsed rock wall, were two children. One of them, a boy around 9 with copper-toned skin and long dark hair in a single braid, sat beside a younger blonde-haired boy, his arm around the other's shoulders. Emily's voice rang out across the distance. "Micah? Nolan?" The older boy stood cautiously. "Who are you?" "I'm Ranger Brooks. I'm here to get you out." At her side, Bear barked once. The boy's eyes widened and his whole face shifted. "I know him," Micah said, awe in his voice. "I know him." He turned to Nolan, who looked confused. "That's the Guardian from the forest." Emily stepped forward slowly. "What do you mean?" Micah helped Nolan up and guided him forward. "He found me once, last summer. I got lost near Ghost Ridge. He didn't bark or bite, just watched me. Stayed with me all night until I found the creek again." Emily stared at Bear. He gave no indication of recognition, just stood still, tail low, eyes soft. "You named him Guardian?" Micah nodded. "He's not just a dog. He shows up when you need him most." Emily crouched to examine Nolan, who had a twisted ankle and a minor scrape across his chin. "You two okay otherwise?" Micah nodded. "We came up here chasing lizards, got turned around. Then the rain washed out the trail. I remembered what Grandfather said. The canyon takes what doesn't respect it. So, we stayed put." Emily smiled. "That's good instinct." She radioed dispatch with their coordinates and signaled for pickup. It would take an hour at least, but now they had time. While they waited, Micah sat beside Bear, stroking the fur along his back. The shepherd leaned into it just slightly. "He's not a pet," Micah said. "He's something older." Emily looked at the two of them, the quiet boy and the battle-scarred dog, and said, "Maybe he's both." When the chopper arrived, kicking dust into the rising air, Emily guided Nolan aboard with Micah behind him. Bear didn't follow. He stood at the edge of the landing zone, tail still, watching. Emily hesitated, then turned and called, "Come on, Guardian." He looked at her for a long beat, then slowly climbed into the chopper, curling into the corner beside the children without a sound. The pilot glanced back, eyebrows raised. "He a ranger now?" Emily gave a tired grin. "Something like that." They lifted off as the sun dipped past its zenith, casting long shadows across the canyon floor. Down below, where silence once ruled, a new story had begun, of a boy, a dog, and the path's only survivors remember. The sky turned copper, first then steel. As the helicopter lifted from Split Rock Basin, the air was already shifting. Emily Brooks sat near the open door of the chopper, her hands steadying the two boys beside her. Micah and Nolan, as gusts buffeted the rotors. Beside them, Bear curled quietly, his head resting against the cabin floor. His chest rose and fell in slow rhythm, but his ears remained twitching, always listening. The pilot, a compact woman named Raina Cruz, with short black hair and a burn scar curling up her left jawline, glanced back from the cockpit with a frown. "Storm's moving in faster than forecasted. I'm dropping you at Ridgepoint Station and heading back for the second group." Emily nodded. "We'll shelter in." Raina had a tough, clipped manner, a former Air Force pilot who'd traded war zones for wildfire extractions. She never wasted words, and she never panicked. That's why the tension in her voice now made Emily's stomach tighten. 15 minutes later, the chopper set down just outside Ridgepoint, a weather-worn ranger station tucked beneath a cliff shelf, built from stone and old pine logs. Emily helped the children down, thanked Raina with a look, and carried Nolan in as the first fat drops of rain began to fall. Micah walked beside Bear, holding one hand gently on the shepherd's back like they had done it before. Inside, the station was dim, musty with the scent of wool blankets, dried meat rations, and pine cleaner. Emily quickly stoked the wood stove, warmed water, and handed out instant oatmeal packets to the kids. Bear lay by the door, watching them, blinking slow. Outside, the storm broke loose. It wasn't the usual desert drizzle. It was a full monsoon surge, crashing wind and slashing rain, the kind that carved new gullies into old stone and sent boulders tumbling. Emily had seen it once before, years ago, when she first took this post. She remembered how the river swelled in minutes, how the trees bent sideways like bowing giants, how the air howled like something alive. Micah sat cross-legged by the window, chewing silently. Nolan curled under one of the thermal blankets, fingers clenched tight. Emily tried the radio again. Nothing but static. Suddenly the station creaked. The wind shifted, the old hinges groaned, and from the cliff wall above, a low rumble echoed. Emily's head snapped up. Rock slide. "We have to move," she said. Grabbing her pack, she threw in the med kit, emergency flares, water canteens, and extra wraps. "Micah, stay close. Nolan, hang on to my shirt." Bear stood before she said a word. He moved to the doorway first, staring into the storm. Lightning split the sky, illuminating his silhouette against the dark, rain-shattered landscape. Then he stepped out, walking low and slow through the downpour. Emily followed, the children huddled close behind. They moved through the whipping wind toward the one place she knew could shield them, a shallow cave 20 yards to the north, hidden beneath a jutting ledge. It wasn't much, but it was stone and dry, and it had held through worse. Bear reached it first. He turned at the entrance, waited until all three had entered, then backed in last, placing himself between them and the storm. As thunder cracked, the cave walls trembled slightly, but held. Nolan clung to Emily's waist, eyes squeezed shut. "Is it going to break?" "No," she said, kneeling beside him. "This rock's older than anything trying to move it." Micah, calmer, crouched beside Bear. "He's watching the wind." Emily glanced over. Bear was indeed facing the mouth of the cave, his body braced, ears forward, eyes locked on the jagged air outside. His fur was soaked, but he didn't move. He didn't tremble. He was shielding them. The storm raged for hours. Emily used her jacket to patch leaks in the cave wall. She wrapped the children tighter, sang softly, an old folk song her grandmother used to hum in storms like these. Bear never left the entrance. Not once. When the thunder finally grew distant and the wind softened to shivering gusts, morning light began to edge through the fog. Emily blinked the exhaustion from her eyes and looked toward Bear. He was lying down now, still, too still. "Bear," she whispered. Micah moved first, crawling to him, laying a hand on his soaked flank. "Izzy?" Emily dropped beside them, fingers to his ribs. No rise, no breath. Her chest clenched. "No, no, no." Then movement, a twitch, a shudder, a slow, deep inhale. Bear opened one eye. It was barely a sliver, but it was golden and alive. Nolan let out a cry. Micah hugged his neck. Emily sat back, breath leaving her in a sob laugh. "You scared the hell out of me." Bear blinked once, then let his head rest again. When the rescue team arrived an hour later, led by a soaked but smiling Reyna and 2 medics with thermal gear, they found a scene none of them would forget. A soaked shepherd, still guarding the cave mouth. 2 boys curled beside him, like cubs beneath an old lion's paws. And Emily Brooks, ranger, rescuer, warrior in hiking boots, with tears on her face and mud on her cheeks, smiling like the sun had just risen for the first time. The canyon was behind them now, but its memory clung to Emily Brooks like dust in her lungs, deep, constant, and almost comforting. The rains had cleared, the children were safe, and Bear was alive. That should have been enough, but she knew something had shifted, not just in her or in Bear, but in the fragile line that connected the wild and the world that tried to civilize it. 2 days later, Bear lay beneath a low tree in the open-air enclosure of the Kaibab Wildlife Conservation Center. The compound stretched over 40 acres of mixed forest and high desert terrain on the southern rim of the Colorado Plateau. It was run by a rotating team of scientists, vets, and forest law officers, many of whom had seen Bear's image flash across headlines after the storm. Guardian Dog Saves Lost Children in Arizona Storm. But headlines didn't change policy. Emily had spent the last 48 hours in back-to-back meetings with the center's board, a room full of gray suits and thick-rimmed glasses. She had argued, pleaded, even snapped once, because they didn't see Bear for what he was. Not just a stray, not just a remnant of military training gone feral, but a story, a symbol, and a survivor whose instincts had saved more lives than half the people in that room. Now, as she stood outside Bear's enclosure, clipboard in hand, the sun behind her cast long shadows. Beside her was the center's director, Dr. Carl Eddings, late 50s. Stocky, always in pressed khakis and a spotless shirt, with the kind of face that seemed built to say no without moving his lips. He had been resistant from the start. "Emily," he said with a resigned sigh, "what you're proposing is unconventional." "That's the point," she replied. Conventional failed him. Eddings adjusted his glasses. "You want us to issue a permit classifying him as a semi-feral ecological sentinel, a canine field advisor. That doesn't exist." "Then create it," she said, turning to face him. "You've issued permits for bobcats with neurological implants, tagged jaguars relocated from Sonora, even rehabilitated bears with prosthetic paws. Bear's done more for these canyons than any of them. He knows this land better than we do. Let him live here, not caged, not released to die, but partnered." Eddings looked at the dog. Bear lifted his head slightly, ears forward, eyes calm. There was something regal in the way he sat, half lion, half ghost, the kind of animal that belonged not in a kennel, but in myth. "We'll give him a trial term," Eddings said at last. 3 months, free movement within the conservation zone. You monitor him, any incident, and we reevaluate." Emily exhaled, nodding. Done. Inside the office that afternoon, she opened her laptop and began compiling her final report for the Federal Wildlife Authority. But before she hit send, she added one more file labeled simply, "Rusk Tourism Group, Violation Evidence." The images she'd captured from Tyler Lance's crate, the blood-smeared cage, the GPS pings from the unregistered lodge site. It was all there. She'd waited until the children were safe, until Bear was secured. But now it was time. The email went out to 4 inboxes, including the Bureau of Land Management and the State Attorney's Wildlife Crimes Division. The world was watching the story of the hero dog. Emily wanted them to see the whole truth too. Outside, Bear was walking again, slow but sure, weaving through the trees of his new domain. Staff watched from afar as he circled the edge of the habitat, pausing briefly to sniff a hollowed tree stump, then trotting toward the water trough at the far end. Later that evening, a group of school children arrived for a guided visit. One of the rangers, Maria Ruiz, a young woman with an easy smile and hair always pulled into a ponytail, led them to the viewing platform. "Over there," she said, pointing through the glass. "That's Bear. He's not like the other animals here. He came back on his own. And he protects more than just himself." Micah was among the group. His eyes found Bear instantly, and he lifted a hand to the glass. Bear paused, turned, and looked directly at him. The boy smiled. Back near the ranger lodge, Emily stood on the porch, watching the trees sway. She sipped coffee from an old tin mug, one corner of her mouth lifted in thought. Bear had changed everything, not just for her, not just for the canyon, but for the way people thought about the wild. He wasn't tame, he wasn't wild. He was the edge where both worlds met, and he stood there like a sentinel no one had asked for, but everyone needed. From behind her, a voice called out. It was Leslie Rayner, her silver-haired friend, and the vet who had helped save Bear's life. She walked with her usual calm stride, wearing trail-worn jeans and a faded jacket with patches from 20 years of field work. A scar above her right brow hinted at an old encounter with a mountain lion. She never talked about it. "So," Leslie said, leaning beside her, "he's official now." Emily nodded. "He's more than that. He's the wild face we forgot how to look at." Leslie chuckled. "You going to be his handler?" Emily shook her head. "No one handles Bear. We just walk with him." As the sun dipped behind the trees, Bear settled at the edge of a boulder overlooking the valley. His fur caught the last light, and his body stilled, ears pricked, eyes open, watching, listening, waiting. He was no longer running, no longer hiding. He was home. In the end, Bear wasn't just a survivor. He was a reminder. That strength isn't loud, and heroes don't always wear uniforms. Sometimes they have scars, walk on 4 legs, and wait quietly in the storm for someone to need them. In our lives, there are moments we feel lost or overlooked, just like Bear once was. But maybe, like him, we're only one act of kindness away from becoming something more. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who believes in quiet courage. Like this video, Subscribe to the channel for more true tales of hope and healing, and tell us in the comments. Have you ever met an animal that changed your life?